Well, it's good to see you here. Open your Bibles up, if you will, to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament. Turn to chapter 22. We will spend our entire time today in chapter 22 of Luke as we begin a new sermon series called His Final Hours. And what we'll be doing over the next few weeks is we'll be looking at the final hours of the life of Jesus before He went to the cross, which of course will lead us to Resurrection Sunday when we celebrate His resurrection on Easter. And so we'll be looking at different events. We're going to pick up the narrative of Jesus' final hours just after He leaves the garden where He was praying with His disciples. Earlier in the evening, He shared the Passover feast with His disciples in the upper room, and then they go to the garden and pray there in the garden. And Jesus has a hard time keeping His disciples awake to pray. And then after prayer, we're going to pick up the story of Jesus' final hours. I guess you could say that this was a bad day. You ever had a bad day before? Well, we're going to call this a bad day because during the passages we're looking at this evening or this morning, we're going to talk about Jesus' betrayal, His arrest, and denial of Jesus from Peter. Makes for a bad day. Let's begin reading together. Luke 22, beginning in verse 47. It says, "While He was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. And he approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?' When the followers saw what was going to happen, they said, 'Lord, should we strike with our swords?' And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, 'No more of this.' And He touched the man's ear and healed him." The betrayal of Jesus takes place just as Jesus and His disciples are leaving the garden. And if you'll remember the gospel narratives that we learned earlier as they were at the Last Supper, celebrating the Passover feast, that Jesus tells His disciples that one of them will betray Him. He knew full well that Judas was going to betray Him. And there in that room, they shared the Passover feast. Jesus washed the disciples' feet, and then Judas left from there to go to betray Jesus. Jesus and His disciples go on to the garden to pray, and then after leaving the garden, Judas approaches them. He approaches to kiss Jesus, and Luke tells us that Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And then as the followers who were there, seeing what is going on, they'd already had a conversation about what would happen if something happened to Jesus earlier in the evening. And so they jumped to action. Now Luke doesn't tell us, but another gospel writer does, that it was actually Peter who takes the sword and he strikes the ear, cuts off the ear of a man by the name of Malchus, who was a servant of the high priest. And this is a pretty incredible thing which happens. Have you ever been, this is the best way I can describe it. Have you ever been in a car accident where maybe the car was going out of control, but it seemed like everything was happening in slow motion, but it was really taking place very quickly? I mean, accidents happen very quickly, but it seemed like everything was in slow motion. And I believe the same kind of drama is unfolding in these events which are happening here with Jesus and His disciples as He's being betrayed by Judas. Peter takes a sword and he cuts off the ear of Malchus. I do not believe that Peter was, this is just me, I do not believe that Peter was aiming for the ear. I think the ear is what he got. He was probably aiming for the head. It was probably a kill shot he was trying to make, but the ear is what he got. And then in the narrative that we read here, almost overlooked is what takes place after this. Jesus tells His disciples to stop, and He says, "No more of this," and He touches the man's ear, and he is healed. And that kind of, as you continue to read, that kind of gets missed in all of this. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen real quickly. Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. The disciples jump out. Peter's flailing a sword. A guy loses his ear. Jesus reaches down and heals his ear, which is amazing within itself. And then the next thing we read about is that Jesus is being arrested and taken off. And it just doesn't seem right that all this incredible stuff is happening so quickly, and then the ear gets healed, and it's like it's just overlooked. The fact that Jesus performed an incredible miracle. Think about it. Think about it if you just lost your ear. How impactful it would be if your ear was suddenly healed. And everybody there in the group, it's just kind of like they miss this. I mean, if I was coming to arrest Jesus and I saw this, maybe I would step back and say, wait a minute, what am I doing here? Or if I was Judas and I saw what Jesus did here, maybe I would have an incredible second thoughts and I would try to stop and say, wait a minute, I kissed the wrong guy. Or this isn't the one, or come up with some other thing to say. But instead, it's just like everybody just kind of absorbs this miracle. Now think about Judas in this scenario too. This wasn't the first miracle Judas had seen. In fact, if we were to classify the miracles of Jesus, this might be a second or third class miracle compared to some of the other stuff he did, which was pretty awesome, that Judas was privy to, that Judas was firsthand witness to. He had seen the incredible things that Jesus had done, and yet he was still willing to betray Jesus, to sell Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. That's pretty incredible. Here's one of Jesus' close friends, the 12 disciples, his close friends. And this close friend is betraying him, selling him out for money. Because Judas because his devotion and love for money was more important to him than his devotion and love to Jesus was. And so he sells Jesus out and betrays him. And to me, I'm thinking, how could he do that? Especially on the heels of this miracle that just happens in the garden. But then I thought, Judas had seen all kinds of other miracles too, right? Yeah. And maybe what happened to Judas is what happens to us sometimes. When we're around God a lot and He's really good to us, we come to a point where we begin to take God's blessings for granted. Yeah. We begin to take God for granted. And when what He's doing all around us isn't impacting us as much because we have a lust for other things. And sometimes in the church, sometimes as Christians, we do that. We take God for granted. And because we take Him for granted, we're willing to sell Him out for other things that we want more. And so Jesus is betrayed by a friend. But then as we continue to read Luke 22 verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and the elders who had come for him, He says, am I leading a rebellion that you come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me, but this is your hour when darkness reigns. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. And Peter followed at a distance. Just as quickly as that, Jesus is arrested and seized and taken away. Even though he questions their motives because he had never been a point of harm to anyone. And yet now he's being arrested as if he was a criminal and taken to the high priest's house. It says that Peter follows at a distance. The other gospel writers tell us that the other disciples, they fled. They went different directions. Maybe not knowing what to do. Maybe, as it says in Isaiah, sheep without shepherds have scattered, and they go different directions. And then as we continue to read in verse 55, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. And a servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight, and she looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I do not know him, he said. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. I am not, man, Peter replied. And about an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter replied, man, I do not know what you're talking about. And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned, the Lord speaking of here, Jesus, turned and looked straight at Peter. And then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. You see, Jesus is betrayed by a friend, and then he is arrested by enemies, and now he is being denied by what I would call a close friend or even a brother, because that's what we call real close friends. What a terrible way for things to kind of unfold. It helps us to understand why Jesus prayed so fervently in the garden, because of all that he was about to go through. I don't think Peter's intention was to deny Jesus. In fact, I think you can commend Peter when the rest of the disciples scattered, that he followed along at a distance. I think Peter had already boldly made a statement earlier in the day. So if you want to look back a few verses in chapter 22 to verse 31, Jesus and his disciples were discussing at the Last Supper some of the events that were about to unfold. And he says to Simon Peter, he says in verse 31, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. And Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. I think Peter had good intentions as he followed Jesus there to the house of the high priest. And as he was warming himself in the courtyard, he was probably there because he felt like he needed to be there because his friend was in trouble. But when it came right down to it, and he was recognized, and he was questioned 3 times of his identity, of being one of Jesus' disciples, he denies knowing Jesus 3 times. 3 times before the rooster crows. And then the rooster crows, and it says that Peter is reminded of what Jesus had told him. And one of the reasons I chose the Luke narrative of this account was because Luke is the only one who gives us the picture of Jesus being there and turning and looking at Peter when he denies him the 3rd time as the rooster crows. See, not only is he denying Jesus, but apparently denying Jesus within earshot, or at least eyesight, of where Jesus was. It wasn't like Jesus was somewhere in a place where Peter couldn't see him, and Jesus couldn't see Peter. He denies him 3 times. Now, there are some takeaways from this passage that I want to share with you, and they're really pretty simple. They're not very, very complicated to understand. The first takeaway from this story is this, that we have more in common, in this story, we have more in common with Peter and Judas than we do with Jesus. Right? Yes, sir. I mean, we have more in common with Judas and Peter than we do with Jesus in this story. We know what it's like to sell Jesus out for something. Every time we run after sin, we run away from Him. We know what it's like. We've been guilty of betraying Him for 30 pieces of silver or whatever it might be. We understand that. There's not a single one of us in this room that can't recognize that and understand that. We also know what it's like to deny Jesus. When we have an opportunity to stand up for Him, to take a stand for Him, to witness for Him, and we do the opposite. We claim we don't know Him, or we back away. Now, you may not stand up and say, I don't know Jesus. I don't know who you're talking about. But what we do sometimes is we avoid situations where we might have to take a stand for Him, because we're afraid to take a stand for Him. So we know about denying Jesus, and we know about betraying Him. We understand Peter and Judas in this story. It's easy for me to understand Peter and Judas. I have personal points of reference in my own life where I can say, that's where I was like Peter, or that's where I was like Judas. And so we recognize this story because we see ourselves in the story. But the second point that we take away from this is this, and this is a real Sunday school answer. I know it is, but it's one that we could put in every sermon we preach here before you each week. It's simply this: we need to be more like Jesus, right? I mean, that's pretty simple, isn't it? We need to be more like Jesus. And I think a preacher can add that point to every message he preaches. We need to be more like Jesus. And as we look at this account, we need to be more like Jesus. Jesus knew what was going to happen. You see, when Judas left the upper room to go betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, Jesus had just washed his feet. Judas walked to the betrayal of Jesus Christ with clean feet because Jesus had washed them. Jesus knew what Judas was about to do. He states what he's about to do there in the upper room that night, and yet he still washes Judas's feet. If it were me washing feet, I'd have got to his and says, "You stink way too bad," and I'm going on to the next guy. But Jesus washes his stinky feet just like he washed the rest of the stinky feet. And Judas, he gets up and with those clean feet, he leaves to betray Jesus. But we need to be like Jesus because Jesus has a spirit of grace and mercy and forgiveness. And even in the case of Peter, it's an incredible thing. Before Peter denies Jesus, did you catch what Jesus said to him back in verses 31 through 34? He says, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat, and I'm praying for you, Simon, that your faith will not fail. And then he says this, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And because before the night is out, you're going to deny knowing me 3 times. What he's saying is you're going to mess up, Peter. I know you're going to mess up. And here, listen, when you turn back, when you return back to me, and strengthen your brothers because they're going to need your leadership. They're going to need your strengthening because that's who you are. I've still got plans for you, even though you're going to mess up. And that's incredible that even before he messes up, he's washing Judas's feet and he's telling Peter to repent and to turn back to him and then to be useful, strengthening the brothers. And another account in the Gospel of John, the story of the resurrection. If you remember John's account of the resurrection, Mary Magdalene is there and she turns and there's Jesus. She thinks he's a gardener at first and then she realizes that it's Jesus. And Jesus' message to her is he says, go tell the disciples and Peter that I'm going ahead of them and I'll be waiting on them.
Yeah, say that.
Now see, that's pretty significant. Because Jesus is looking Peter in the eye when he's denying him. And Peter sees Jesus looking at him and he knows that Jesus was right when Jesus said he would deny him and that Jesus knew he was denying him. And yet when he gives this message after his resurrection to Mary, he says, tell the disciples and Peter. Now listen, if I were writing this story or if this was the great American novel, this would be a great plot twist for a revenge story right now. Jesus has resurrected from the dead. Peter denied him when he could have stood up for him. And so Jesus could say, hey, go tell the disciples, Mary, except for Peter. Because I don't have anything for Peter because he denied me. Now we would write that story that way, right? Because we have those sayings like, I don't get mad, I just get even, right?
That's right.
Well, I mean, that's the way we operate. When somebody does us dirty and doggone it, we're going to do what we can. Their day will come and I'm going to be there. I'll laugh when it happens. But yet Jesus says, go tell the disciples and Peter.
Yeah, preach on.
And Peter, because you see, it's all about His amazing grace and love that He has. And even though we're like Judas and we're like Peter, we need to be like Jesus. Listen, if the church of Jesus Christ was like Jesus, there's no way we would be able to fill everybody in because that kind of love and grace is irresistible. Amen? It's irresistible. That's what I desire. I want people to love me even though I'm flawed and I'm guilty. I still want to be loved and forgiven. And that's what Jesus did. He went to the cross not because of anything He had done, but because what we had done. Peter is denying Him. And yet one of the first things He says after His resurrection is, tell Peter that I'm waiting on him. You see, we need to be more like Jesus. And the third takeaway is this. Go ahead and put this one up for me, JR. The third takeaway is this. We should simply be prepared to be a witness for Jesus. I think Peter, somewhere in the process of all the drama that was going on, got wrapped up in the moments. And he wasn't ready to be a witness for Jesus. Maybe with Judas never truly loved the Lord like he should. Judas was too in love with the world. And that's why he was willing to betray Jesus. And unfortunately, that's a problem that plagues us today. You can be way more in love with the world than you are with Jesus. And if you are, you're willing to sell Him out for things. But Peter, I do believe, was committed. I think he followed Jesus into the courtyard that night because he was still willing to take that stand. But when he found himself in a place where he was surrounded by opposition, and he became afraid to take that bold stand for Jesus that he said he would take earlier. When he saw the other people, and he saw that there may be consequences to his actions, that maybe he would be arrested, maybe he would be put in prison, maybe he would even be killed. And so with the fear of that laying upon him, instead of standing up and being a witness for Jesus, instead of doing that, in the moment, he denied Jesus. In fact, he apparently had forgotten that Jesus had already told him that he would deny Him 3 times before the rooster crowed until the rooster crowed. And then he remembered.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we can be guilty of the same thing. Listen, we have a drive to be accepted by other people. Now, I know we're all at different levels with that, different levels of maturity, and some of us may have already come through some of that place in our life, but there's a drive for us to be accepted by other people. And it may not even mean the threat that we're going to be arrested or even put to death to stand up for Jesus. It may be for us that we're just afraid that somebody won't like us.
Yeah, say that.
If we stand up for Jesus. And the problem is the reason that we have this problem is because I think we forget what Jesus has done for us. And when we forget what He has done for us, I mean, if I were to question you, what did Jesus do for you? You would get a check mark if you were answering a test. You would say, well, Jesus died for my sins. But I think in the moments of life, we forget what Jesus has done for us. And when we forget what He has done for us and what He's doing for us and what He will do for us, when we forget all of that, we forget to take a stand for Him. We're not prepared to stand up and give an answer for Christ when we're in opportunities to do that.
Yeah.
And so then our fear becomes stronger, and it's too easy for us to put our eyes upon the world and not upon Jesus, and we're just not prepared. We forget that someone is watching us. When I was a kid growing up, we lived in a little community down in southeastern Kentucky called Keevee, Kentucky. For the uninformed, Keevee, Kentucky is the center of the universe, and that's where I grew up. And in our little house that we lived in there, we had neighbors who our property line went right up against their property line, and they were an older couple. Their name was Boyd and Sadie Lewis. And I, as a young kid, I was about 7 years old when we moved in next to them. As a young kid, I thought Boyd and Sadie were about 115 years old. I mean, I really thought they were really old. And they were what we affectionately call, in my part of the country, mountain people. Meaning they grew up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. And so they were a little different than some of the rest of our neighbors. But I lived there from the time I was 7 to the time I was 18. Boyd Lewis, I called him Mr. Lewis because I was afraid to call him by his first name. He was a big man. He wore overalls every day. And he wore an old railroad cap on his head every day. And every day he would come out. Sometimes before we would leave the house, he would already be out there on his front porch. And his front porch kind of faced our back porch. And so everything that was going on at our house, he could see. And everything that was going on at their house, we could see. And he would come out on his front porch and he would sit in a ladder back chair, straight back. He didn't even sit in a rocking chair. He sat in that ladder back chair every day for hours. And he'd just watch. I mean, nothing happened at our house that Mr. Lewis didn't see. Everything that went on. And so we became very mindful that somebody was watching. Well, the whole time that we lived there, I got to know Mr. Lewis. He would come over to the fence and he'd say, little boy, come over here. And I'd go over the fence and he'd start talking to me about stuff. And I'll just be honest with you, when I was young, most of the stuff he was talking to me about, I didn't understand what he was talking about. I didn't. He was just talking about stuff and I'd listen and nod. And as I got older, I began understanding that the things he was sharing with me were nuggets of wisdom. I guess if you live to be 115, you got a lot of wisdom, and he was sharing with me nuggets of wisdom. And as I got older, I began to really appreciate what he said. And my affection for him really grew. I had great respect for Mr. Lewis with the things he would share. He'd talk about going ginsenging, and he'd talk about things that you do in the mountains. And he even built his own casket before he died. And he had it stored in a building behind his house because he was ready for death. He'd say, young man, said, people just passing through in this world. People just passing through. And he would share those nuggets of wisdom. Well, when I was about 12 years old, I was out in the front of the house and I was really mad at my sister. She had done something evil. I don't remember what evil thing it was. I just know that it was evil because it was done against me and I was mad about it. And so I had to pay her back for her evil acts. And so I grabbed her bicycle and I took it to the end of the driveway and I rode her bicycle down the driveway just as hard as I could. And when I got to the end of the driveway where we had a bunch of stuff kind of piled behind, at the end of the driveway, I jumped off of the bicycle and the bicycle went BAM! And crashed. And I thought, that's what she deserves. I remember standing there kind of puffed up thinking, all right, I feel good about this. I wrecked up her bike pretty bad. And that's when I realized that Boyd Lewis was sitting on the porch. And he had seen it all. And just as quick as that, what I felt was triumph immediately became guilt. Because I knew that old man was watching me. And I knew what I had done wasn't right. Even though I may have felt good about it immediately, I felt bad about it just as quick. Because I knew he was watching me.
Yeah.
There is always someone watching us. He never takes his eyes off of us. And you know why he's watching you all the time? It's not because he wants to catch you in something, although because he's watching, he catches us in stuff, doesn't he? Yeah. He's watching you all the time because he loves you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why Jesus went to the cross as silent as a lamb before his shearers. He went to the cross and stood for us because he loves us. Even though sometimes we look like Judas and sometimes we look like Peter, but all the time he looks like Jesus. We're going to sing a couple of songs today to respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to stand with me. And I want to give you an opportunity today to make a decision for Jesus. There'll be a couple of us standing off in the wings that you can come and speak with us directly, especially if you're here today and you don't know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. You've never accepted him, never been baptized, never began your journey walking with Jesus. We want to encourage you to come to Jesus. Some of you, you've been walking with him. You know he's been dealing with you. But there's some stuff in your life right now that you want to lay out before the Lord. You need some help with, some strengthening. Maybe you've got some issues that you want somebody to pray with you. We want to meet you here today. And so we're just going to be over in the wings where it's going to be very convenient for you to come and speak with us, because we want to help, because the Lord has been watching you and he wants you to know that he does not want you to be alone. And you don't have to be alone. Now, there may be another decision in this room today. In fact, this is the decision I want to call the most of us to today. And that's a decision to be prepared to be a witness for Jesus. Maybe you've been going through life and going through the motions as a believer, but really not been serious about being ready to give an answer to who Jesus is. In 2 Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, he says, be ready. Be instant, in season and out of season, to give an answer for the message of Jesus Christ, to who Jesus is. And for you, your decision may be one that you make while you're standing here singing, but it's a decision that you're going to say, Lord, from now on, I'm going to be more serious about being ready to give an answer to my friends and my family about who you are. Because I'm going to tell you something, your friends and your family need you to give an answer about who Jesus is. Jesus is. Jesus is. Jesus is. Jesus is. Jesus is.